As one of the most popular characters in Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, a lot of people were excited to see how the remake for the Nintendo Switch would address Vivian specifically, seeing how her gender was handled differently in international releases of the game. It was a topic of discussion so widespread that at times it felt inescapable even when trying to use YouTube for largely unrelated purposes. From this moment onward, I'll have to insert some of my own opinions, so bear with me as I may say something that will rub you the wrong way. I couldn't care less if Vivian was cisgender or transgender because I am of the belief that whether a character is good or bad, what they are should not matter. It's only fair. Had the writing for her been good, not only would I not care, but quite frankly, congratulations to the people who were holding their breath for how Vivian was handled. Or at least, I'd like to congratulate those who were. But after playing the remake myself, I have to admit that amidst the many writing changes made when bringing this game back, a lot of them really frustrated me. Most of them left me only somewhat disappointed, but I can respect that a different generation is getting to play this wonderful game, and so toning down some of the rough edges is a necessary evil considering today's internet climate. However, how Vivian was handled quite frankly pissed me off. And in this video, I intend to explain exactly why that is. Let's begin. The core issue I have that will summarize every complaint I have is that the remake has Vivian just randomly confessing this fact about herself to someone she literally just met entirely unprompted. The reason I think this is bad is because it violates one of the most basic rules of storytelling: show, don't tell. I'm not a writer, but as a viewer, I can tell you that if you can communicate story beats through showing information rather than just telling it, it tends to feel more organic and works much better in really getting your audience to feel what your character is feeling. Telling us something is efficient if the information isn't particularly important, but showing is much better at stirring the heart and getting you the care. Now, it's not lost on me that in a game as text-based as TTYD, you're obviously going to be limited in ways to visually communicate information. However, to say show don't tell does not mean you can't communicate information purely through dialogue. The whole point of show don't tell is you need to communicate information naturally.
Well, I was first in line until the little hairball was born.
That hairball is my son and your future king.
Characters don't exist in a vacuum, and seeing how they bounce off of each other can naturally communicate lots of important information for later in a creative work. Disney films are exceptional at this and know how to make every second count.
But when it comes to brute strength, I'm afraid my big brother will always rule. Not always, Scar. One day, it'll be my son who rules. Simba will be your king.
Or at least, they used to. Now, it probably goes without saying that Vivian's story failed to stir my heart and get me to care about her, which is actually a pretty big strike against her considering I did care about her when playing this game on GameCube. This is just me making an inference, but I feel like Vivian getting the reception she's gotten has more to do with how much attention she's gotten even before the remake's release. People already had their own opinions on Vivian as a character because she had a nasty older sister who would treat her like dirt, and non-English translations of the original TTYD suggested, if not outright confirmed, that she was a trans woman. In that sense, the TTYD remake I feel holds some similarities to the Lion King's 2019 remake, where it managed to thrive by tapping into the nostalgia of the audience who grew up with the game back when it was new. The difference though is that the majority of changes that were made to its dialogue didn't conflict with the story, and the gameplay, the most important element, was still largely intact. This also isn't exactly a perfect argument either, since the Switch has a significantly bigger install base than the GameCube, but it's nonetheless guaranteed at least some people who played the remake have played the original. I would know, I'm one of them. And yes, I am insinuating that people are projecting onto Vivian's story based on assumptions for how the writing would be. You're likely thinking, but the remake does show us that Vivian is trans, or at least the results of it. We see it all through Beldam.
Objection!
Yeah, that's where the problem lies for me. See, the dialogue to spark what I believe to be the main reason Beldam has developed the reputation she has in the remake is her relation with Held comment, which both people and wikis have used as evidence to suggest that Beldam refuses to call Vivian her sister. However, the reality is actually much more insidious. What people are calling a transphobic action on Beldam's end takes an entirely different form when examined alongside all of the dialogue between her and Vivian. And I'll be diving into exactly what that is as this video proceeds, but I first want to define what right is. Now, if you want to just get into my analysis of the dialogue and me shedding light on this quote from Beldam, you're more than free to skip to chapter 2. but I feel this will be important in setting the foundation for my point. Before touching on the original Japanese version dialogue, I need to make this point. While a lot of Beldam's bullying is kept in the remake, the details that are more closely related to Vivian being a transgender woman are changed for one reason or another, essentially making Beldam not come across as attacking Vivian for being trans at all, and seeing Vivian be the only person drawing any attention to her transgender status. This change was likely done because having an actually transphobic character in the eyes of Nintendo would bring about bad press, because it would shed light on the reality that discrimination exists. To help build my point, I used an image translator alongside a speedrunner's gameplay, and the sources on the Super Mario Wiki to see what the original dialogue was. You see, in the GameCube Japanese version of TTYD, Beldam actually did make deliberate comments at the expense of Vivian by bashing her over suggesting that the Shadow Trio were the Shadow Sisters. Beldam makes it explicitly clear that she does not see Vivian as a woman at all. By censoring these details, it changes the meaning behind why the characters act the way they do. See, here's the problem with deviating from the original text in the Japanese, Italian, or whatever version in the name of restoring representation. If you change the text but don't understand why the writing was the way it was, you run the risk of missing important information when bringing it to a new audience. It'd be like if you were to make an adaptation of a story like, say, Pinocchio. For those unaware, Pinocchio was a morality tale about a puppet learning to become a real boy. But to do so, he had to first develop a conscience. The original story had him skip school and run out to locales like Pleasure Island to engage in delinquent behavior like smoking and drinking. And he actually suffered consequences for doing bad things. It's a simple plot. Your main character does bad things happen to him. And it worked this way because it was to communicate that this type of behavior was frowned upon for children to engage in. If he were to say try going to school and had bad things happen to him, then forcing him to do something like the bad thing he initially turned away from, first off, it teaches Pinocchio that doing good things doesn't work. And secondly, even if he didn't pick up on that, his moral compass was already pointing in the right direction, so he wouldn't be learning anything worthwhile anyway. If you change elements of the writing haphazardly, you run the risk of confusing, if not breaking the writing that was set up by the original work. As such, it really feels to me like people are reading into a story something that isn't actually there. At no point did I ever see Beldam treat Vivian like dirt because she was transgender. It all just looked like cliché antagonistic behavior expected of siblings at the time TTYD originally came out. I saw it in shows like Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, Coding Kids Next Door, and The Fairly Odd Parents. And since this is a remake, context for the time period at the time ends up mattering a lot. The 2000s were a much more cynical time in animation where a lot of sibling relationships were toxic and rough. And being TTYD originally was released in 2004, the standard fare that could just communicate a typical toxic sister dynamic wouldn't be enough. So what exactly did the remake do in regards to Vivian's story? Well, not much. From what I could tell, the only part that has any relevance to Vivian being trans is her coming out as much to Mario while as a shadow in Chapter 4. That's it. If you're wondering about what was said between Beldam and Vivian in Chapter 2, I'd say it's insufficient to put it mildly, especially when looked at side by side with the original GameCube release, regardless of the language used. For example, the English version swings headlong in the opposite direction of most translations of the game, making Vivian a cisgender female. People have taken issue with the censorship here, but I'm not one of those people, as I believe Vivian's story still flows fine. Beldam's response to Vivian screwing up their name introduction still works fine in making Beldam perfectly fit the role of a bully by having her unnecessarily insult Vivian by calling her plug ugly. And Vivian's response to apologize and explain how she made the mistake does a good job at displaying humility, giving her an out by appearing genuinely confused. And really, that's all this video is going to boil down to. I don't care if Vivian is trans or not. I care that her story in the remake is badly written. So how did the remake screw it up? A common point people would bring up to suggest the idea that Beldam is transphobic towards Vivian is her relation with Held comment shortly before the Shadows engaged Mario for battle. However, this falls apart when you examine all of the previous dialogue to come before it. The first thing I want to address is that despite the speculation surrounding if the Switch remake would be more accurate to the Japanese version, Beldam still calls her sisters her lovelies, something she only did in the English release as far as I'm aware. And there, Vivian was a girl from birth. In case you're not aware, The word lovely, when defined as a noun, means an attractive woman. A word choice Beldam never would have opted for if she did not believe Vivian to be a girl. This is a significant piece of evidence that goes against the idea that Beldam does not consider Vivian to be a she. In fact, when Beldam goes on to grill Vivian over her mistake, she not once ever calls Vivian out for being trans, but instead focuses entirely on why her mistake was a dumb one to make. The second reason the dialogue doesn't work to imply Beldam is transphobic is, instead of denying Vivian of what she's claiming in that the trio are all sisters, she attacks the choice of words Vivian used because of wanting to appear more mysterious and scary to their enemies. Which is a baffling decision because it makes Beldam look a lot less antagonistic for no good reason. Inversely, she puts Vivian on the back foot by suggesting Vivian has a history of going against her sister's directions. Something really funny with ample foresight, knowing Beldam considers Vivian a traitor. And thirdly, Vivian's response. If I was judging the dialogue choices by chess notations, I label Vivian's rebuttal here a solid double question mark because, wow, it's a blunder. See, even if you disagreed with Beldam's logic, Vivian doesn't offer a real rebuttal after apologizing, instead just expressing to Beldam that it makes her happy to be called Beldam's sister. This is not a good response. At all. Now, I think the intent behind Vivian saying this is to establish that there's friction between her and Beldam over how Vivian wishes to be identified. But it doesn't work narratively. First of all, this is an inappropriate time to try having a heart-to-heart, because the three have a job to do and they just encountered their target. Beldam doesn't even lash out at Vivian over being trans here, instead opting to call her sappy. It sounds a lot more like she just does not have time for sentimentality right now, rather than denying calling Vivian a girl. Secondly, what this instead does is it portrays Vivian as being more preoccupied with what she wants, as opposed to helping her sister achieve her goals. Something that conflicts with her entire character arc, as it only works due to the one-sided absence of empathy on Beldam's end. Beldam's future call-out of Vivian when she calls her a traitor also becomes stronger, because a history of going against her sister's direction has been established. Third, there is no room for excuses for Vivian to pull from, because she confirmed that this was not a mistake, not an accident, but a purposeful act of defiance. Meaning Beldam, the character we're supposed to hate, is now in the right. And fourth, because of this, Beldam is entirely within her right to call Vivian sappy, which doesn't even suggest any denial over what Vivian wishes to be known by. She's just insulting her for derailing the introduction, which ordinarily would be uncalled for, but not when she implies this is a problem she's had to deal with repeatedly. She doesn't come off as a bully, she comes off as justifiably flustered. Meanwhile, Vivian doesn't come off as well-meaning or inexperienced, she comes off as childish and immature. And to think this all started because of one additional word. It just begs the question as to how people could have misinterpreted this statement as badly as they could. Are people really just that eager to see Vivian's transgender status be affirmed to them? Or was this an act of bad faith because Beldam is just not worth caring about? Well, I believe the former to be true. In case you forgot or weren't aware during the times where we were waiting for the remake to be released, speculation on whether Vivian would be transgender in the remake was very much prominent. Channels like GameXplain would speculate on gameplay footage if Vivian's gender identity would be localized internationally. And the source that expired one of the videos on the topic was literally the very last bit of dialogue Beldam spoke before she and her sisters engaged Mario for their first fight. The dialogue that included Beldam's relation with Held comment, which made people wrongly believe that it was a subtext of Beldam denying calling Vivian her sister.
This screenshot comes from Mirror Gaming's preview of the game, featuring Mario's first encounter with the Shadow Sirens. However, the scene is a little different than it was originally. In the original game's English localization, Beldam says, "The might of the three Shadow Sirens will be more than enough to win the day," referring to the three of them as Sirens, or sisters, and all girls. However, now in the remake, Beldam's dialogue is a bit different, instead saying, "The might of the three shadows, relation withheld, will be more than enough to win the day." Originally, this detail was kept to only a small few versions of the game, with Beldam refusing to accept Vivian as a woman. But here, the mention of them being sirens, or sisters, aka all girls, is gone. We currently only have this one clip to go off of, so here's hoping we see more soon.
obviously unintentional, but the facts stand that Beldam has become a victim of cherry-picking the evidence, where people jump to conclusions as to how Beldam would act before we had all of the facts. For those unaware, cherry-picking is a fallacy where evidence is either incomplete or selectively chosen to argue for a position while ignoring evidence that could run contrary to it. I want to make clear that there's nothing wrong with speculation. You have every right to be excited, anxious, or whatever, and I think it's great that people are putting their passion out there because it shows how much people truly care. However, in light of the fact that the game is actually out now, I don't think it'd be unfair to ask people to reevaluate Beldam's dialogue now, because we actually have all of the context we're going to get now. Another point that I like to raise is that even if this being a subtext was the intention, it being true would mean Beldam would have to be written to act out of character, as her actions would contradict themselves. Beldam's not a character that needs to try and be subtle about how she feels about anyone or anything. She has the subtlety of an average YouTube comment and tends to say what she means and means what she says. If she really wanted to give Vivian a hard time for being trans, I wholeheartedly believe she wouldn't sugarcoat it and would aim to make Vivian as miserable as possible by denying her being a woman entirely and directly, especially in light of how frequently Beldam makes it a mission to send Vivian on the verge of tears. Likewise, the odds of Beldam caring about saving face in front of people unrelated to what she could be talking about are extremely low. If she cared only about tormenting Vivian when others weren't around to witness it, she'd have acted accordingly when Marilyn was warning her about Mario being nearby, instead of keeping up the assault. Not to mention Twilight Town, where she publicly belittled Vivian, calling her a useless little fool among other insults. It just does not make sense. And in case you're still not convinced, I have further evidence to decisively prove that Beldam being transphobic towards Vivian is not only unlikely, but actively impossible. You see, there is actually evidence that confirms that even if Beldam genuinely refused to give Vivian any amount of satisfaction regarding justifying her gender, being transgender wasn't a catalyst for how Beldam would treat her following her transitioning. And this evidence actually comes from Vivian herself when she comes out to Mario as a shadow. Buckle up, because I have a lot to say about this chunk of conversation specifically. In Vivian's own words, she says, "Truth is, it took me a while to realize I was their sister, not their brother. Now their usual bullying feels heavier." I want to draw your attention to one particular word here, and that word is usual. What would this word suggest about Beldam and Vivian's relationship before Vivian committed to being the other gender? If you asked me, it would strongly suggest Beldam always saw Vivian as a target for abuse. It's possible that Beldam got worse after the fact, I won't deny that's a possibility, but that would just confirm that Beldam was always a tool. And as I've said before, that behavior sadly would be very much typical of the media at the time. However, let's give Vivian the benefit of the doubt and take her words at 100% face value. If the bullying actually did get worse following her transitioning, that would serve much more as evidence of Vivian's naivete than transphobia on Beldam's part. I don't know how well understood this is, but girls can be mean. Especially to other girls, even including their own family. Not only do I know this from experience, but if I'm being honest, it's not exactly inaccurate to how girls were portrayed in older cartoons either, even though the dynamic the Sirens have now is unique to the remake. And trust me, I have the receipts to back this up. Nonetheless, sisters are sisters, and when push comes to shove, they tend to stick together. Like how when, I don't know, the Shadow Sirens were hightailing it out of Chapter 2 and Vivian got distracted thinking about the necklace that Beldam dropped. You see, Beldam didn't just abandon Vivian when she was slowing around, which would imply she knows not to leave Vivian alone with Mario, someone she has reason to believe would be dangerous. Honestly, seeing the way Beldam was handled and contrasting that to how others perceive her character makes me question if we even played the same game. Because while in the original releases of TTYD, there are no signs of unconditional love from Beldam at all, she actually seems to care about Vivian's physical health at the bare minimum. Even if you disagree with the logic I'm presenting, Vivian's moment here where she comes out to Mario does nothing to suggest Beldam denies calling Vivian her sister, despite what some sources claim. I've even heard one person claim that because Beldam regularly lies in the game, she could simply be lying about affirming Vivian's gender identity. Ignoring one, to assume Beldam's actions are not genuine is acting in bad faith. It's entirely possible to be immoral in one area, but holding enough honor to respect another.
I'm crazy enough to take on Batman, but the IRS? No, thank you.
And 2, any other lies Beldam told were to Grotus, which had relevance to her end goal, resurrecting the Shadow Queen. She quite literally confesses this shortly before the final boss. There's meanwhile no greater importance to how she treats Vivian, it's just being mean for the sake of being mean. And not only would this clash with what we've seen earlier in Chapter 2, we even have confirmation that Beldam is willing to validate Vivian in calling her a woman. The last thing we see Beldam say to Vivian before she abandons her confirms that her calling Vivian her lovely was more than a figure of speech. Come, Marilyn. Let's leave this useless little fool to her chore. Okay, this dialogue here is making me, this is giving me some questions. So I know about the translation basically updating to reflect more of the other dialogue and other translations of the game. I think it's interesting how Beldam is still referring to Vivian as a she. You think if she was actively like anti-transgender people, she'd probably refer to Vivian by her birth gender and not the gender she goes by now? The writing is genuinely confusing me because I don't think that it feels like it wasn't really updated enough to really reflect the direction they're taking Vivian in now. Yeah, that's my point, lady. If they're gonna try and like make a like why would they take that out then if they're trying to like emphasize the fact that Vivian herself is actually transgender? Like that line right there where she actively called Vivian her would kind of go against any kind of idea that that Beldam is actively against whatever choice Vivian made as far as how she wants to identify herself, wouldn't it? It also kind of hurts that we also earlier in the game saw that well, not even so much that what we saw, but more like what we just did not get to see. Like in Chapter 2, there really wasn't any kind of sign as far as Vivian being misgender before, or even seeing Beldam make comments on it specifically. I guess maybe there's a relation with hell text? I don't know. It feels like by trying to like give her that extra agency then, Vicky, it kind of downplays the very real reality that transgender people actually do suffer from persecution all the same. Dupless, I don't freaking care. I'm too lost in thought thinking about Vivian. What you just heard was my original reaction to seeing this bit of dialogue was entirely unchanged from the GameCube English version. I barely even have to say anything for this one. Beldam's calling Vivian by she/her pronouns. There is not even an ounce of sarcasm in how she says her here. Not even quotation marks. Even if I was to agree that there is no love in this cold crone's heart to treat her own sister like such a dog, I'd be darned if I said she didn't at least respect pronouns. That's a step above transgender hatred in the real world. Or at least on the internet. See what I mean when I talk about show don't tell? I'm being told that Beldam is this awful person because she's transphobic, at least by people who are talking about her and Vivian's relationship. But I'm shown that she not only does not mind calling Vivian a woman, but she actually has a genuine cause for complaint, and I'm instead inclined to believe that Beldam probably wouldn't treat her so crudely if Vivian wasn't so preoccupied with what she wanted when she's not the one calling the shots. And as a result of this, it actually does a lot of damage to Vivian's story, as Mario has absolutely no frame of reference for any type of bigotry Vivian is implying she suffers from. As a matter of fact, Mario has seen absolutely no evidence to suggest that Beldam is abusive or even a bully at all. He wasn't there to see Beldam was fibbing about the sketch in Bogley Woods, and even saw firsthand Beldam was telling the truth in that Vivian makes it a habit to consciously ignore orders. Vivian being defiant isn't an inherently bad thing at face value when she abandoned her sisters in the original game, because it was well communicated that Beldam was the one who'd always strike first. It's no longer true in the remake, and now at our lowest point, Vivian is delivering us a warped perspective on her family drama, making us believe she suffers for a reason unrelated to anything we've seen earlier in the game. Combine this with the fact we never see Beldam give Vivian any flack for being trans at all. Beldam could have misgendered Vivian, which should in all honesty be the bare minimum attempted if the remake wants to try and communicate this point. She could have swapped out calling Vivian sappy back in Chapter 2 with another word like delusional, to suggest she'd be wrong to think that. Heck, you could have taken a page out of the difficulty mod Rita's building for TTYD, Hero Mode. and have Beldam challenge Vivian over the necklace she found. I can accept that you probably couldn't get away with going as hard as Reed did with the dialogue, but there's nonetheless no excuse for this remake's dialogue to be so freaking cowardly. In short, the TTYD remake, at least to me, severely stunted Vivian as a character. This is an issue I actually have with a good amount of the dialogue in the TTYD remake in general. I get it. In this modern age, you can't risk pissing off marginalized groups of people. This is why, for example, instances like Luigi's Bob-omb partner Jerry no longer comments on being traumatized by seeing Luigi in a bridal gown, and instead comments on Luigi being a klutz in heels. It's also why the remake has removed comments potentially offensive towards fat people, like with Hefty on the SS Express. And I guess you can't have characters we're supposed to like have rough edges by saying anything potentially offensive or something. I personally think it's really sad, as products of their time should be preserved to more closely reflect the culture of the time, but whatever. Listen, I get that a lot of the dialogue wasn't designed for people like me. After all, what do I know? I'm a 230-pound obese man with the fat of a whale. I guess seeing someone be called a chub should be a trigger for me. However, I would say the remake went way too far in trying to spot clean instances where the dialogue can come off as too mean. I kind of understand why the heroes and allies got this treatment, but why the bad guys? This is a game where there's a literal noose in the town square, and you see gang and mafia violence seconds after stepping foot in town. But a trio of Goombas who amount to near nothing can't call Mario fat or catcall his female partner Goombella. It isn't like this dialogue was exclusive to the English version either. The Japanese text on GameCube also had this catcalling, and it was even preserved to an extent in the Japanese remake. It doesn't make sense why, in the spirit of being inclusive, the game's writing wouldn't simultaneously demonize rightfully frowned upon behaviors like harassment and sexism, especially if the goal was to more closely match the Japanese version dialogue. Besides, what does Mario need someone to stand up for him for? He routinely stomps Goombas into putty, and even if looking exclusively at Paper Mario, this game is a sequel. He fought spiky Goombas all the way back on the Nintendo 64. Meanwhile, Goombella loses out on her shining moment of standing up for herself when she was a damsel in distress shortly before now. The thing is, though, most of the censored dialogue doesn't really change anything for the story or the arcs of characters as a whole. There's nothing substantial that's lost by no longer having Lord Crump show his more sexist side when trying to interrogate Goombella, or Mario no longer being able to call Francesca a sob sister. It just makes her dialogue more tepid, and that's really it. Moreover, some of the dialogue changes are genuine improvements over the English release. A reference to Paper Mario 64 was restored through Kapook's email that mentions the Crystal Palace, which is actually a very clever reference, seeing that it's a dungeon full of mirrors and Kapook's name is a palindrome. Other times, the dialogue was improved solely because it fixes mistakes in the original text. A lot of typos were corrected, like the Twilight Town guard using the incorrect homophone when saying martial law. I even learned a new word that I at first thought was a Futurama-type rewording of chub. Removing the blatant transphobia from Beldam not only makes her a less interesting character, but it actually makes Vivian worse, because there's not a strong pushback against her for being so quick to bring up her transgender status. It doesn't feel organic or earned how it comes up, instead feeling like Vivian is actively trying to force it in. And it ends up being obnoxious for Beldam not because she hates Vivian for being trans, but because her being trans is causing grievances for Beldam in situations where it's entirely unnecessary to even come up. It just leaves me asking, what's the point? If Vivian being trans is only as a result of restoring representation, but the remake isn't going to back it up with any meaningful commentary or even show it in any way beyond a single line of dialogue, it doesn't come off as genuine representation. It comes off as arbitrary. This isn't a nitpick. This is a major gap in the storytelling that's required to make people who don't already agree with you actually care about the story you're writing. And the whole time, it's never actually answered. Vivian's just that way because she is. And that's not even me strawmanning. This is the literal defense that actual living, breathing people will use in real life as if they can't tell the difference between real life and a fictional character. I actually found myself sympathizing more with the alleged transphobe than the character we're supposed to adore, just because I find people with behaviors like Vivian in real life to be beyond annoying. Not for what they are, but because behavior like that is expected of people who believe the world revolves around them. And I doubt I'm alone in holding the opinion that people who are super revved up in themselves are not people that are enjoyable to be around. It's not cute or endearing, it's at best tone deaf and at worst conceited and manipulative. And I wholeheartedly believe that Vivian deserved better. Now, I have more problems with how Vivian's story was handled in the remake, and I could definitely go more in depth with my problems with her portrayal specifically, but for time reasons, I feel it would not be wise to make this video longer. I feel like I've done a good job at making my point that the remake did a bad job with Vivian's story and Beldam's characterization, and that's all I set out to do. I know my opinion here is bound to be controversial, but trust me, I wouldn't be talking if I didn't care. I'm not in the business trying to virtue signal and regurgitate your values back to you. I'm just here keeping it real, and I hope you can appreciate that. This has been Phantom A. Thank you for watching.